She was 6 years old and had never seen a single color in her life. Her father was the most feared man in 3 counties, a man whose name made loan sharks go quiet and rival clubs cross the street. And he had spent 4 years and every dollar he'd ever earned trying to give his daughter something as simple as daylight. Every specialist had the same answer. Every surgeon had the same shrug. Every hospital waiting room smelled the same, antiseptic and broken hope. And Griffin Grim Holloway had sat in all of them, leather vest folded across his lap like he was trying to be someone smaller, someone softer, someone the doctors might take seriously. They never did. And now, on a freezing Nevada evening outside Reno, in a forgotten roadside park where the swings were rusted and the lights barely worked, Grim was pushing his daughter back and forth while the wind off the high desert cut through everything. And a barefoot homeless boy was watching from a bench 20 feet away, watching like he'd seen something the rest of the world had completely missed. What happens next will destroy you. If you've never cried watching a biker take off his vest and drape it over a child's shoulders, you're about to. Stay with me all the way to the end. Hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Let's go. The park had no name on any map. It sat 3 miles east of Reno's neon sprawl on a county road that most people only used when the interstate backed up, a forgotten strip of chain link and cracked asphalt that the city had stopped maintaining somewhere around 2009 and never thought about again. 2 swing sets, one with a broken chain. A concrete bench with a crack running through the middle like something underground was trying to split it apart. A single sodium light on a pole at the far end that buzzed and flickered and threw everything into that particular shade of orange that made even healthy things look sick. Griffin Holloway had discovered this park 3 years ago when Ava was 3, and he'd needed somewhere to take her that wasn't the apartment, wasn't the clubhouse, wasn't anywhere that had other people and their eyes and their questions. He'd been coming back ever since. Same bench to set his coffee on. Same rusted swing that Ava loved because she said the squeak it made sounded like a bird trying to decide whether to leave or stay. She couldn't see the park. She had never seen anything, but she could hear the swing's complaint against its chain. She could feel the cold bite of metal through her mittens. She could smell the sage that blew in from the desert when the wind shifted east, and she would turn her face into it with an expression so nakedly peaceful that Grim sometimes had to look away because it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and it broke something in him every single time. "Higher, Dad." Her voice was small against the wind. She was bundled in a purple parka that was slightly too big. He always bought them a size up, force of habit, planning ahead, and her dark hair whipped around the edges of her wool cap. Her eyes were open, pale gray like early morning sky, and they tracked nothing. Never had. The pediatric ophthalmologist in Sacramento, the 4th one, or maybe the 5th, Grim had stopped counting, had used words like bilateral congenital obstruction and optical membrane adhesion, and Grim had sat in that chair and heard none of it because he was watching his daughter sit on the exam table, swinging her legs and humming something to herself, completely unbothered, completely trusting, completely unaware that the man across from her father was giving them the same speech they'd already heard 4 times before. There is no surgical approach that carries an acceptable risk profile. Grim had pushed the chain link higher until Ava laughed. He pushed it higher now, one hand against the small of her back, the cold cutting through his leather jacket, and the flannel underneath and the old thermal he'd had since his army days. His knuckles were scarred, 2 of them badly, the left index finger that had been broken and reset wrong. And his wedding ring was gone, had been gone for 2 years, but the pale band of skin where it used to live was still visible even in the sodium light. Some things take longer to disappear than others. He was 41 years old and he looked 50, the kind of 50 that comes not from age but from sustained load-bearing. The lines in his face were deep, carved by Nevada sun and cold and wind, and the particular exhaustion of carrying something you can't put down. His beard was dark with silver threaded through it. His eyes were the same gray as Ava's, but where hers held open light, his held something banked and careful, the look of a man who had learned to see threats before they announced themselves. President of the Iron Veil Motorcycle Club, Reno Chapter. That title meant something in this part of Nevada. It meant that when he walked into a bar, conversations adjusted. It meant that phone calls got returned. It meant that a certain category of person, the kind who collected debts with their hands, the kind who moved product through back roads at 3 in the morning, gave him a wide berth and treated him with the specific, careful courtesy that people reserve for things they understand could hurt them. It meant nothing to the pediatric ophthalmologists. He'd thought once, early on, when he was still capable of that particular kind of foolishness, that the money might change things. That if he showed up with enough of it, real money, not insurance money, the kind that went into a doctor's personal account through channels that didn't require paperwork, that someone would try harder. Look further. He'd spent $300,000 across 4 years. He had spent it honestly, through proper channels, because this was his daughter, and he was not going to compromise this. He'd spent it at major medical centers and research hospitals, and twice at clinics overseas, once in Germany and once in South Korea, and he'd sat in those foreign waiting rooms with Ava in his lap, reading to her from whatever book she'd brought. And he'd felt the hope drain out of him each time like water through cracked concrete. The last appointment had been 2 weeks ago. The specialist, a woman, young, earnest, genuinely sorry, had said the same thing they all said eventually. That Ava's condition was stable, non-progressive, and that while the quality of her life was, and would continue to be full and rich, the likelihood of any intervention restoring functional vision was very low. Ava had asked, on the drive home, why he was so quiet. He told her he was just tired. She'd said, "I know when you're sad, Dad. You breathe different." He hadn't answered that. He'd kept his eyes on the road and breathed as evenly as he could until it was true. That had been 2 weeks ago. Tonight he'd brought her to the park because he didn't know what else to do with what was sitting in his chest, and the clubhouse was too loud and too full of eyes that knew him, and he needed to be somewhere that didn't require him to be grim. So he pushed her swing and listened to it squeak its indecisive bird song, and tried not to think about anything. He didn't notice the boy on the bench until the boy stood up. Eli Mercer was 12 years old. He had been living rough for 14 months. Before that, there had been a foster placement in Sparks that lasted 8 months and ended when the foster father lost his job and the household economics collapsed in a way that left no room for an extra body. Before that, there had been 3 weeks in an emergency group home that smelled like industrial cleaner and defeat. Before that, there had been his mother, and then there hadn't been. And Eli had learned not to think too hard about the sequence of events between those 2 points, because thinking about it didn't change anything, and it made his chest do something he couldn't control. He was not a large boy. He was thin in the way that comes from irregular meals rather than natural build, with the kind of wiry toughness in his arms and shoulders that develops when a body decides that if it can't have plenty, it will at least have efficient. His hair was overlong, dark, pushed behind his ears. His shoes were a pair of canvas sneakers that had been donated to a church 3 blocks from the park, and he'd been wearing them for 6 weeks, and the left sole was beginning to separate. He was barefoot tonight because the sneakers were wet. He'd washed them in the park bathroom and laid them on the concrete bench to dry, and the cold didn't bother him the way it might have once. He'd built up a tolerance. That was something. You could build a tolerance to almost anything if you had enough time and no alternative. He'd been in this park for 3 nights. It wasn't bad as parks went. The bathroom had running water, which was more than some places offered, and the sodium light stayed on all night, which kept away a certain category of trouble. He'd found a location behind the concrete equipment shed at the park's south edge where the wind didn't cut directly, and he had his sleeping bag and his backpack with his 3 books and the small waterproof pouch where he kept his documents, the ones that proved he existed: birth certificate, the defunct Medicaid card, a library card he'd had since 2nd grade that he kept because it had his name on it, and some days that mattered. He was good at being invisible. He had learned it the same way he'd learned everything useful in the last 14 months, by absolute necessity, by paying close attention to what worked and abandoning what didn't, by watching how people moved through the world and identifying where the gaps were that he could slip through without being seen, without being trouble, without generating the particular kind of attention that led to police involvement and group homes and everything that came after. He'd been watching the man and the little girl for 40 minutes, not because he was nosy. Eli had trained himself out of nosiness as a survival behavior, curiosity about other people's business-created situations, and situations were dangerous. But this was different. He'd been watching because of the girl's eyes. He'd noticed them the first time they walked by the bench, the man's big hand wrapped around the girl's small one, guiding her around the crack in the concrete path without breaking stride. Doing it the way you do something you've done 1,000 times. The girl's face had been tipped up toward the sky, not tracking anything, just open and receiving whatever the world gave her in terms of sound and air and sensation. Her eyes, in the brief moment he'd seen them clearly, had caught the sodium light in a particular way. He'd seen something like that before, once, on himself. 7 years ago, when he was 5 and his mother had been trying to get him seen at a free clinic in Elko. He had a memory, not quite reliable, filtered through 5-year-old perception, of sitting on a paper-covered exam table while a doctor shone a light in his eye, and the doctor saying something to his mother in a careful voice, and his mother asking a question, and the doctor saying something about a membrane, a thin membrane, and that it was actually quite a straightforward procedure, relatively speaking. He hadn't needed the procedure. Whatever they'd seen had apparently resolved on its own, but he remembered the word. Membrane. And he remembered what it had looked like in the one mirror in their apartment, that thin, translucent covering over the surface of his eye. How it had caught light differently. How it had looked like a second eyelid that hadn't gotten the message to leave. He stood up from the bench. Every single thing he knew about survival told him to sit back down. The man pushing the swing was not a person you approached in the dark in a park. The leather vest, the club patch on the back, the bearing of him. The way he stood with that particular settled weight that said he had been in enough trouble to know he didn't have to go looking for it. All of it said, maintain distance. This is not your business. You have nothing to offer here and everything to lose. Eli stood there for a long moment in his bare feet on the cold asphalt and thought about all of that. Then he walked forward anyway. Outside, Grim heard the footsteps. He'd been hearing footsteps in public places with a certain portion of his attention for 20 years. It was not paranoia exactly, but rather professional awareness, the low-level tracking of his environment that had kept him alive through a decade and a half of organizational politics that occasionally turned physical. He knew what footsteps meant before he consciously registered them. The spacing said young, the weight said small, the hesitation said uncertain, approaching anyway. He turned. The kid stopped. They looked at each other. The boy was thin, barefoot in November, hair that needed cutting, wearing a jacket that was decent quality but too big and starting to show wear at the collar. No effect of threat, no effect of anything except a very specific combination of determination and fear that Grim recognized. He'd seen it on young men who'd done something that required courage they weren't sure they had, who were committed to the action but hadn't fully resolved the terror underneath it. Grim didn't move. He was positioned between the boy and Ava without having consciously placed himself there. It was reflex, had been reflex since the day she was born, the automatic geometry of protection. The swing slowed. Ava said, "Dad?" "It's okay, Bug." He didn't take his eyes off the boy. "What do you want?" The kid's jaw tightened. He had a point to make and he was going to make it even though his hands were shaking slightly in the cold. "Your daughter's eyes," he said. His voice was controlled but young. "There's something on them, a membrane. I've seen it before, on myself, when I was little." He swallowed. "A doctor said it was removable. I think—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I know this sounds insane." The cold settled between them. Grim's first instinct was the fence, the instant wall he'd built over 4 years of specialists and dead ends, and the particularly crushing quality of hope that turns out to be nothing. His second instinct was to step forward and physically redirect this kid away from his daughter and back toward wherever he'd come from. His third instinct, the one that came from somewhere deeper and older than the others, was to remember that the thing you most want to dismiss is sometimes the thing you most need to hear. "You've been watching us," Grim said. "Yes, sir." No apology in it. Honest. "Why?" "Because I saw her eyes in the light, and I recognized what I was seeing, and I didn't know how to not say something about it." Ava had stopped swinging. She was perfectly still, her face turned toward the voice with that particular attention she gave to things that interested her, the precise orientation of someone who had learned to read the world entirely through her other senses. He sounds scared, she said, but not mean scared, just nervous scared. Grim looked at his daughter for a moment. What's your name? He said to the boy. Eli Mercer. How old are you, Eli Mercer? 12. You got parents somewhere. Something moved through the boy's face. It was there and gone in half a second, but Grim had spent 20 years reading the micro-expressions of men under pressure, and he caught it. The involuntary tightening around the eyes, the very slight drop of the chin, the way a face closes over something to keep it from being visible. No, sir, Eli said. The words sat in the freezing air. Grim looked at the boy for a long time. The parking lot was empty. The sodium light buzzed. The wind came off the desert with that particular November edge to it that felt personal. Show me what you're talking about, he said finally. Don't touch her. Just show me where you're looking. Eli walked forward on legs that felt unreliable. Up close, the man was larger than he'd appeared from a distance. Not just tall, but occupying space differently, the way people do when they've spent a long time being the thing other things move around. The scarring on his hands was visible. The gray in his beard, the eyes, pale gray in the sodium light, that held something patient and something dangerous in the same moment and could shift between them without warning. He stopped a few feet from the girl on the swing. Can I look? He asked her directly. She considered this. What are you looking for? Something on your eyes, in the light. He hesitated. I won't touch. I just want to see if I'm right. About what? About whether there's something that shouldn't be there. Ava turned her face up. The sodium light caught her eyes and Eli leaned in slightly, and there it was. Clearer now, undeniable, what he'd thought he'd seen from 20 feet away. It was translucent, nearly invisible unless the light hit it at exactly the right angle, but it was there. Both eyes, a thin biological membrane seated against the surface of each cornea with the delicate persistence of something that had grown slowly and hadn't been disturbed. It wasn't the same as what he'd had. His had been thicker, more centrally placed. Hers was different, finer, like a film of breath on cold glass, and it covered more surface area. But the quality of it, the way it caught and diffused light, was the same category of thing. Sir, he said, and he tried to keep his voice steady, I need to be honest with you. I'm not a doctor. I have no idea if I'm right. But I think... He turned to look at the man, who was watching him with that still, dangerous patience. I think what's blocking her vision might be a membrane, like a physical covering. And I think I saw a doctor remove one once with just... They use something like a thin instrument and they just... He stopped. I think it might come off. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Eli had ever been inside. Grim's face didn't change. That was what was frightening. He'd expected anger, dismissal, the particular contempt that adults reserve for children who spoke out of turn about things they didn't understand. He'd expected to be sent away. The man's face didn't change at all. He was just processing with a terrible focused stillness, and Eli had no idea what was on the other side of that processing. 4 years, Grim said finally. His voice had changed. Something had dropped out of it. 4 years and $400,000 and a dozen specialists and not one of them. He stopped. The muscles in his jaw moved. What makes you think you can... I don't think I can. Eli said it quickly. I'm not saying I should do it. I'm saying someone should look. Someone who knows what they're looking for. Someone who knows about membranes. Because every doctor who looked at her, they were looking for something complicated. They weren't looking for something simple. Ava said quietly into the silence. I want to try. Grim looked at his daughter. Bug. Dad. Her voice was 6 years old and ancient. I want to try. What happened next was the kind of thing that Grim would never fully be able to explain. Not to his club brothers. Not to himself. Not to the part of his brain that had kept him alive by being ruthlessly rational about risk. He was the most careful man he knew when it came to his daughter. He had triple-vetted every specialist, researched every procedure, paid for second and third opinions, driven across state lines for consultations he'd spent weeks vetting in advance. He looked at this 12-year-old barefoot kid in a park at 9:30 at night, and he said, What do you need? Eli blinked. He hadn't expected that. Uh, he thought fast. His mind had always been quick. It was one of the things that had kept him functional in circumstances that had unmade other people. Good light, close light, and do you have anything thin and flat, like... He looked around the park helplessly. Grim reached into his vest pocket and produced a thin-bladed folding knife. Eli stared at it. Not the blade. He looked at his own hands. His fingernail on his right index finger was trimmed very close, but the edge was smooth and clean. He'd kept them clean because keeping them clean was one of the small dignities he'd held onto. He crouched down in front of Ava. She was perfectly still. Her face was tipped toward him, that open, receptive orientation, completely trusting in a way that hit him somewhere low in the chest. She didn't know him. She had no reason to trust him. She trusted him anyway, with the absolute, undefended openness of someone who had learned to move through the world by deciding that fear was less useful than faith. He took the small flashlight Grim had produced from somewhere. The man's preparedness was automatic, reflexive, and he shone it at the angle he needed, and he looked. There. Right there. The edge of the membrane, at the outer margin of the left eye, where it had perhaps thinned slightly with age or had never quite fully adhered. A seam, almost. A beginning. Ava, he said, this might feel strange, but not painful. I promise. If it hurts at all, I stop immediately. Okay? Okay, she said. He looked up at Grim. The man's face was something he'd never seen on an adult before. Totally stripped of the protective layering, just raw, the face of someone who has been carrying an unbearable weight so long that they've forgotten what it feels like not to carry it, and who is now standing at the edge of something that might either save them or add one more wound to the collection. If I'm wrong, Eli said quietly, nothing bad happens. I won't hurt her. If I'm right, do it, Grim said. The words came out rough and low. Eli turned back to Ava. He positioned his fingertip at the edge of the membrane with a steadiness that surprised him. His hands were warm and sure, the trembling from the cold forgotten. He found the seam. He pressed gently. The membrane released. It came away from the left eye in one continuous motion, delicate as tissue paper, an almost biological sigh. And Eli held his breath and caught it between his fingers as it separated completely, and he moved immediately to the right, same process, same careful pressure at the thinnest margin, and the right eye released its covering in the same way. And then there was nothing between Ava Holloway's eyes and the world. 30 seconds. Maybe less. Maybe. The park was silent except for the buzzing sodium light and the distant wind and the faint creak of the empty swing chain. Then Ava Holloway made a sound. It was not a word. It was not a sentence. It was the sound a person makes when something that has been locked away for 6 years suddenly opens. A single sharp intake of breath that was also almost a cry, strangled halfway between joy and pure shock, and her hands went up to the sides of her face as if she needed to hold her own head together while her brain processed an input it had been receiving in theory for 6 years and in practice for the first time in this exact moment. The sodium light blazed orange and enormous. The chain-link fence glittered. The cracked concrete path stretched away into a distance she had never been able to see. The sky above was absolute winter black, studded with Nevada stars, and the small round face of her father was 3 feet in front of her, pale and split open with something beyond language, tears running freely down his scarred cheeks, and Grim Holloway, who had not cried in front of another person since the night his wife died, stood perfectly still and let it happen. "Dad?" Ava whispered. He couldn't answer. "Dad." Her voice cracked and rebuilt itself. "I can see you." He dropped to his knees on the cold concrete. He gathered her against him and held her with the very specific ferocity of someone who has learned that the things worth holding can be taken. And he made a sound against the top of her head that he would have died before making in front of any living person. And Eli stood 6 feet back and watched all of it, with his arms wrapped around himself against the cold and his throat doing something complicated and aching. He should have left. This was not his moment. He'd done the thing and the thing had worked, and now he should become invisible again. That was the protocol. That was what kept you safe. He didn't move. It was Ava who broke it. She pulled back from her father's chest and turned her face and saw Eli standing there, really saw him, the first time she'd ever truly seen another person who wasn't her father. And she looked at him with those newly uncovered gray eyes, and she saw everything she needed to see in about 3 seconds flat. The bare feet, the too big jacket, the particular careful stillness of someone accustomed to making themselves small. "You're cold," she said. "I'm okay," Eli said. "You're barefoot." "My shoes are wet." She considered this with the gravity of someone who has just received the gift of sight and is choosing very carefully what to spend it on first. Grim had gotten to his feet. He was swiping at his face with the back of his hand, not embarrassed exactly, but moving past it with the efficiency of a man who has processed the emotion and is now returning to function. He stood and looked at Eli, and the look was different from before. Before had been careful assessment, the threat calculation of a man protecting his daughter. This was something else, something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary he normally operated with. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Grim said. "I've got a spot," Eli said. "Where?" "Behind the equipment shed," he gestured. Grim looked at the equipment shed. Then he looked back at Eli. Something moved through his expression that was not quite pity. Grim Holloway did not do pity, had burned that capacity out of himself long ago as a luxury he couldn't afford, but it was related to it, cousin of it. "How long?" Grim said. 14 months. The cold settled between them. Ava had her hands on her father's arm, and she was looking around the park with a focused incredulity, taking inventory. The broken swing, the flickering light, the dark line of the chain-link fence, the stars overhead. Cataloging everything with the expression of someone who has been told about the world through words and is now discovering that the words were approximately right, but that the actual texture of existence is at once more ordinary and more overwhelming than any description prepared her for. She kept coming back to Eli. "You live here?" she asked. "For now." "By yourself?" "Yes." She processed this. "Are you hungry?" "Ava," Grim started. "Are you?" She was looking directly at Eli with those newly open eyes, and there was something in her expression that was not childish at all. It was the particular clear-eyed assessment of someone who has spent 6 years developing senses other than sight, and has consequently built a kind of perception that operates below the level of social training, below the armor that sighted people develop as they learn to look away. "Yeah," Eli said. He said it simply because lying to this kid seemed wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Grim was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the park, rattling the chain link, carrying the faint sound of traffic from the county road, and beneath that, very faintly, the distant rumble of engines, Harleys unmistakably, somewhere west of them on the highway. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced his phone. He looked at Eli while he dialed. "Yeah," he said into the phone. "Get something together. Real food, not whatever's left in the freezer. I've got—" He paused. His eyes stayed on Eli. "I've got someone coming in who needs to eat." He ended the call. He looked at the boy for another long moment. Then he took off his club vest. Eli didn't understand what he was looking at, not fully. He knew what a motorcycle club vest meant in the general sense, knew it was significant, knew it was not a casual garment. He didn't know the specific weight of what Griffin Holloway was doing when he unzipped it and stepped forward and settled it across Eli's thin shoulders, because Eli had not spent 20 years in this world, and didn't know that this man had never taken that vest off for another person in his life, except to hand it to prospects during formal ceremonies, and this was neither. The leather was warm from the man's body. It was enormously heavy, the patches and hardware and the embroidered iron veil skull on the back adding a weight that was not just physical. It smelled like leather and motor oil and cigarette smoke and something underneath those things that Eli couldn't name. "You're cold," Grim said, "and before anything else happens, that gets fixed." He put his hand on Eli's shoulder. The hand was large and scarred and careful. "You got a name on you that means something to someone?" Grim said. He wasn't being cruel. He was asking a real question in the only way he knew how to ask things, which was directly. Eli thought about the library card in his waterproof pouch, the name on it, the question of whether that constituted meaning to someone. "Not anymore," he said. Grim nodded. The nod meant, I understand. It meant, I'm not going to push on that right now. It meant several other things that Eli couldn't fully decode yet. You will, Grim said. Ava had slipped her hand into Eli's. He looked down at their hands, her small, purple, mittened hand wrapped around his bare, cold fingers, and something happened in his chest that had no precedent in the last 14 months, that had no precedent maybe in his whole life, something so unfamiliar that his first instinct was to identify it as a threat because it was that disorienting. He had no category for it. His survival architecture had no file for this. He stood very still and let it happen and didn't pull away. They walked to the parking lot where Grim's truck was. The motorcycle was back at the clubhouse he'd driven tonight because of Ava, and Grim opened the door and let Ava climb in first, and then looked at Eli with that same careful, stripped-down expression that the streetlight made look older and more tired than the face of any person should have to look. "Get in," he said. Eli got in. Matt. The drive to the Iron Vale Clubhouse took 20 minutes through the eastern edge of Reno's sprawl, past the casino hotels that blazed at the dark like something trying to argue against the night, past the industrial blocks and the cheap motels, and the areas that hadn't been touched by the city's recent renovation money, because the city's recent renovation money had not been interested in touching them, and then into a section of commercial warehouse district where a converted building sat behind a chain-link fence with motorcycles lined up along the front like a particular kind of fence of its own. Eli counted the bikes as they pulled in. 14, 15, 16. More visible through the fence in a side lot. The building itself was large and low, converted from something industrial. Loading dock doors repurposed into a wide entrance. The interior lit with warm amber light that was visible even from the lot. The sound of voices and music and boots on hardwood floors, audible through the thick walls as a steady vibration. Grim parked. He looked over his shoulder at Eli in the back seat, who was sitting very still with the club vest still across his shoulders, and Ava's hand still in his because she'd kept hold of him the whole drive and he hadn't found a way to release it. "You don't have to say anything in there," Grim said. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. You eat, you warm up, and after that, we'll figure out what comes next." "Okay," Eli said. "People are going to look at you." "I know." "Let them look." Eli nodded. Grim studied him for another moment. "You scared?" He thought about lying, decided not to. "Yes, sir." "Good," Grim said. "Means you're paying attention." He got out of the truck. Something in the set of that, the compact acknowledgement, fear as information rather than weakness, landed in Eli's chest and stayed there. The clubhouse interior was exactly what Eli's imagination had populated it with, and entirely different at the same time. The air was dense with cigarette smoke and wood smoke from a fireplace at the far end, layered under the smell of food, something cooking, meat and garlic and something fried, and coffee, industrial quantities of coffee, the bitter bottom-of-the-pot kind that had been sitting too long and nobody had bothered replacing. The floors were old hardwood, gouged and dark with age, and the boots that moved across them moved with authority, heavy and deliberate, the percussion of people who take up space without apology. 20, 25 men in the main room. Various ages. Late 20s to one man who must have been in his 70s, white-haired and leather-vested and built like a fireplace himself. Various degrees of conversation and motion. The walls held photographs, framed news clippings, a mounted set of deer antlers, 3 guitars in different states of repair, a flag that Eli couldn't identify. They noticed Grim the moment he walked in. They noticed Eli approximately 1 second later. The conversation didn't stop. It adjusted. That was different, Eli registered. This was not the pointed silence of a group discovering an intruder. It was the recalibration of people who were reading a situation and hadn't reached a conclusion about it yet. Grim put his hand on Eli's shoulder again as they walked in. The hand did something. It changed the geometry of Eli's presence in the room. It said, "This person is with me." The specific gravity of what that meant in this particular room, among these particular people, was information that moved through the space faster than words. A man peeled away from a group by the bar. Broad, dark-bearded, maybe 45, with sergeant-at-arms on his vest and the specific careful quality of someone whose job was to notice things. Grim. His eyes moved to Eli. Who's the kid? His name's Eli, Grim said. He needs to eat. The sergeant-at-arms, whose name Eli would later learn was Marcus, who had done 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan and had arrived at the Iron Veil by a route that was complicated and violent and that he discussed with nobody, looked at Eli for a long, level moment, not hostile, assessing. Kitchen's got enough, Marcus said, and went to get a plate. Eli ate at the end of a long wooden table while Grim sat across from him, and Ava sat beside him and explained everything she could see in the room with the focused cataloging joy of someone discovering color for the first time, which was exactly what she was doing. She had never seen the color of fire before. She kept looking at the fireplace. She had never seen what a face looked like when it smiled. She kept looking at the men who walked past and smiled at her, and she studied each smile with enormous concentration, cross-referencing it against 6 years of sonic and tactile data. You, she said at one point, pointing at a man across the room who had the specific weathered quality of someone who had spent decades outdoors. You sound like what gravel feels like. The man, later introduced as Bone, who had been with the Iron Veil for 22 years, and who had a voice that had been further modified by a throat injury 15 years ago, looked startled and then made a sound that might have been a laugh. That's probably right, he said. Eli ate. The food was real. Pasta, bread, a piece of chicken, coffee that he cut with a significant amount of sugar from a bowl someone had put in front of him without being asked. And the warmth of the room was doing something to him that he was trying to manage, trying to regulate, because he knew what happened when you let warmth in too fast after being cold too long, and it was not always physical. He ate steadily and looked at the table and tried to stay controlled. He was not entirely successful. At some point, Grim had excused himself and moved to a corner with 3 other men, the ones Eli would later understand formed the core of the club's leadership, and had a conversation that involved frequent looks in Eli's direction. Not hostile looks. Something else. Something that made Eli's shoulders tighten with the old animal instinct that preceded being moved somewhere, being reassigned, being someone else's problem. Ava noticed. He's not going to make you leave, she said quietly. Eli looked at her. How do you know? Because of how he looked at you in the park. After. She considered. He looked at you the way he looks at things he's decided are his to take care of. I know what that looks like. He looks at me that way. She said it with perfect matter-of-fact certainty, the way someone states a thing they have learned through evidence rather than hope. Eli looked back at the table, looked at the club vest across his shoulders. He hadn't taken it off because he hadn't been asked to, and taking it off without being asked felt wrong somehow. The leather was warm now from his own body heat. My mom used to call me her little scientist, he said. He didn't know why he said it. It came out before he decided to say it. Because I used to notice things, small things, things other people missed. Ava was quiet for a moment. Like membranes, she said. Yeah. Is she... She stopped, recalibrated with a sensitivity beyond her years. Never mind. She died, he said. 14 months ago. I'm sorry. I know. He looked up at her. Your mom. 2 years ago, she said. Dad doesn't talk about it, but he gets a certain kind of quiet on Thursdays. She died on a Thursday. They sat with that for a moment, the shared grammar of loss, the recognition of each other's specific species of alone. Across the room, Grim's conversation had shifted. He was talking now with a quiet focus that Eli recognized from the body language, as a man making a decision he'd already made who was now making it out loud for the record. The other men were listening and nodding, and the nodding was not reluctant. My dad runs this place, Ava said, following Eli's gaze. All these guys, they're not scary once you know them. Bone has a greenhouse, he grows tomatoes, Marcus makes his own pasta. Weird stuff. They seem... Eli struggled for the word. Safe, Ava said. That's the word. They seem scary on the outside, but they're safe. I figured that out when I was like 4. before I could see. You can tell safe from unsafe by the sound of it. Safe moves different. She looked at him. You're safe too, by the way. I could tell in the park, when you talked. Something tightened in his throat. He looked at the table again. Grim came back and sat down across from him. The room around them was its ordinary self, the noise and smoke and the particular living texture of a place where people have gathered for a long time and laid down layers of shared experience the way geological strata accumulate. And Grim sat and looked at his daughter, who was looking at everything, who was seeing the world for the first time, and then he looked at Eli and said, "You need somewhere to sleep tonight." It wasn't a question. "I've got a—" "Not the park," Grim said. "There's a room. End of the hall, back of the building. It's been a storage room, but it's got a bed in it, and it's warm, and the lock works." He paused. "Just for tonight." Eli understood the qualifier. Just for tonight meant this is not a promise. It meant I know what I'm doing is unprecedented within my own understanding of what I do, and I need the bracket of just for tonight to make it make sense. "Okay," Eli said. The just for tonight lasted 3 weeks. By the second week, nobody was calling it that anymore. What Eli learned about the Iron Vale Motorcycle Club over the weeks that followed was different from everything he'd assembled from the outside about what a club like this was. He'd expected hierarchy, and it was there, but it was not the hierarchy of authority for its own sake. It was the hierarchy of competence and history, of men who had earned particular roles through particular experiences, and who exercised those roles with the specific seriousness of people who understood what the alternative looked like. He'd expected rough edges, and he found them everywhere, in the blunt speech and the occasional violence of argument, and the ever-present knives and the motorcycles and the leathers and the patches. The whole visible architecture of a world that had not made peace with the larger world and did not intend to. But underneath all of it, in the joints and seams of the thing, Eli found something he had not expected. He found fathers. Not all of them were fathers in the literal sense. Marcus had no children, Bone's daughter hadn't spoken to him in 8 years, 2 or 3 of the younger members were barely past being boys themselves. But there was something paternal in the collective organism of the club that expressed itself in specific and consistent ways. In the way they noticed when someone was struggling and didn't make a production of it, just adjusted the weight distribution, just quietly made things easier, without requiring the struggling person to announce themselves. In the way they told stories about their own failures, not with shame, but with the specific generosity of men who decided that if their disasters had to exist, then at least they could serve as education for whoever came after. In the way they looked at Ava and Eli, not with the managed attention of adults tolerating children, but with something genuine and specific, the look of people who understood that the small and the vulnerable were worth protecting, not because they were helpless, but because they were real. Eli had been invisible for 14 months. He'd been good at it. He'd cultivated it as a skill and a survival mechanism, and he'd told himself that invisibility was a form of freedom, that having no one was cleaner than having the wrong ones, that he was self-sufficient in a way that constituted a kind of strength. He was starting to understand, in the particular slow way that fundamental reassessments occur when the evidence is gentle rather than violent, that he had been wrong about that. The room at the end of the hall became his room. Nobody made an announcement about it. Bone appeared one afternoon with a proper mattress and said nothing except, "The frame's already there," and left. Marcus came the following day with a lamp and a small desk and a reading chair that had seen better days and was perfect. Grim brought school supplies, notebooks, pens, a laptop that was 3 years old but functional, and set them on the desk and stood in the doorway looking at them for a moment before leaving. Nobody asked Eli to be grateful. Nobody required demonstration of gratitude. The gifts arrived the way the food had arrived that first night, because someone noticed a need and had the capacity to address it, and there was no particular conversation required around that. He started tentatively to understand what family felt like. Not the performance of family, not the administrative assignment of family, but the actual texture of it, the small daily frictions, and the comfortable silences, and the way you learned another person's habits, not because you were told, but because you were present long enough for the patterns to become visible, Because you lived in the same air and ate at the same table and heard the same arguments about who left the coffee on too long and who had left the gate to the parking lot unlocked again. Ava was a revelation. She had 6 years of accumulated seeing to do, and she was doing all of it simultaneously, discovering that the world had a visual dimension at the same time that she was living in it fully. She approached color with the intensity of a researcher. She had notebooks full of color comparisons, of attempts to describe in words what she was seeing and how it corresponded to the sensory framework she'd built without sight. Red was what she'd always called the feeling when her father's voice got quieter before he got angry. Blue was the highest notes of the music she liked, the ones that felt like they were reaching. Green was the sound of rain on the window of a room you were warm inside. She taught Eli to see differently. Not because his vision was impaired, but because she'd spent 6 years building perceptual equipment that he'd never needed to develop, and spending time with her recalibrated his attention to the textures of experience that sighted people learn to skim past. The exact quality of the light at a particular time of afternoon, the way a room full of people sounded different when someone important entered it, the temperature of another person's body warmth at 2 feet of distance in a cold space. They sat together most evenings. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Ava would paint. She'd discovered paint with a ferocity that alarmed and delighted the men of the Iron Veil, most of whom had strong opinions about things like motor specifications and political affiliations, and would not previously have predicted that they'd develop opinions about color theory. And Eli would read or write in the notebooks he'd started filling with the same compulsive cataloging that had kept him sane in the park. He was good at school. He went back, enrolled quietly through Grimm and the processes of the county system, and the teachers in his new school discovered within the first 2 weeks that they had a student who learned material in one exposure and whose problem was not attention but the opposite of it. He had too much. He noticed everything. He was ahead of the curriculum in 3 subjects and needed the curriculum to catch up to him in a 4th. He did not talk about where he'd been. The school knew he was a ward of the court. Technically, the mechanics of his situation had been addressed through channels that Grimm had navigated with the particular competence of someone accustomed to dealing with systems from the outside. The counselor knew enough to know that pushing would not help. The teachers knew enough to give him the books and stay out of the way. He did not talk about his mother. Not to the school counselor, not to Marcus, not to Bone, not to the 2 or 3 club members who had tentatively, carefully, extended the specific unspoken invitation to conversation that men of that generation extend to young people they want to give room to. The invitation shaped like a shared task, something mechanical to focus on while the actual conversation happened around the edges of it. He talked to Ava. Not all of it. Not the parts that were still too raw and formless, but the outline of it, the basic facts of it. In the evenings when they were sitting together and the room was warm and she was painting something and he was supposed to be reading but wasn't. She listened the way she'd always listened, with her whole body, the way she'd learned to listen before she could see, with a quality of attention that made the speaker feel accurately received, not processed, but actually taken in. She didn't say the things people usually said. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "that must have been so hard," or "you're safe now," in the reflexive way that adults deployed those phrases to move past the discomfort of a child's grief. She listened, and then, sometimes, she said something precise and unexpected that demonstrated she'd actually heard what was underneath the words rather than just the words themselves. Once she said, "Do you think she knew she was going to leave?" He thought about that for a long time. "No," he said finally. She thought she had more time. Ava nodded and went back to painting. That was enough. It was exactly enough. The night the Iron Veil formally acknowledged what had already been true for 2 months came 3 weeks before Christmas. It began as a regular Thursday dinner. The whole club assembled, which happened every Thursday, the long tables in the main room covered with food that had been collectively produced over the afternoon, the fireplace going, the particular quality of noise that accumulated when 20-some men who knew each other well were all in the same room and didn't need to perform anything for each other. Eli and Ava sat at the end of the main table with their usual quiet arrangement between them. She had brought her most recent painting to show Bone. She'd been working on a still life of the objects on Grimm's desk, which included a very battered leather-bound notebook, a photograph in a frame, a coffee mug with a cracked handle that he'd refused to replace for reasons he declined to explain. The dinner had been going for an hour, the room at its comfortable peak of noise and warmth and belonging, when Grimm stood up. He did not bang on anything or call for silence. He simply stood, and the room found its own way to quiet by the specific gravity of who he was. The room adjusting itself around him, the way rooms full of people adjust around the one person everyone else is keyed to. He talked for 10 minutes. Eli sat very still and heard his own name and heard the story of the park, told in the stripped-down economical way that Grimm told all stories, without decoration, without editorializing, the bare structure of it, the membrane, the park, the dark, the moment of seeing, and felt the room absorbing it, felt 20-some sets of eyes move to him and away and back, and felt the quality of those looks change as the story progressed from assessment to recognition to something he didn't have a word for. Grimm said, "He's been living here 2 months. Some of you have figured that out. The rest of you know it now." He paused. "He's good people. He's got good instincts, and he works hard, and he takes care of Ava when I can't be here. He doesn't ask for more than he needs." Another pause, longer. He needs more than he's asked for. The room was completely quiet. "I'm not asking anybody to do anything specific. I'm saying he's here. He's part of this. What that means, practically, is up to each of you." He sat down. The quiet held for perhaps 3 seconds. Then Bone stood up. He walked the length of the table to where Eli was sitting and put a key on the table in front of him. "Greenhouse," Bone said. "You want to learn? I'll teach you." He went back to his seat. Marcus stood up. "You need a ride to school in bad weather. Come find me." He sat down. One by one, around the table, men stood up and said something or put something on the table in front of Eli. Not every man. Some stayed seated, and some of those were doing something with their faces that suggested the sitting was deliberate, was them handling something they didn't want to display in public. The ones who spoke were brief. What they said was specific. Not gestures in the direction of care, but the actual architecture of it. Knowledge they would share, time they would give, skills they would teach, practical protections they would extend. Eli sat through all of it with his hands in his lap and his throat doing the complicated aching thing, and his face, if anyone had been reading it carefully, showing the expression of a person who has been braced against a wall for a very long time and is feeling the wall no longer there and isn't sure yet what to do with the open space. He didn't say anything. He didn't know what there was to say. The words that would have been right. "Thank you. This means something. I didn't know this was possible." All of them were true, and none of them were adequate, and he sat with the inadequacy of them and let it be. Ava took his hand under the table. He held on. Outside in the parking lot, the Harleys sat in the cold like a row of patient guardians. The Nevada sky above Reno was clear and absolutely freezing and full of stars that Ava had only been able to see for 2 months and still studied with the particular focused wonder of someone who can't quite believe the inventory. The wind came off the desert carrying sage and cold and distance, the smell of everything that stretched out in every direction from this particular warm building full of these particular broken and protective people. Inside, the dinner resumed. Someone turned the music back up. Someone made more coffee. The conversations rebuilt themselves and the room returned to its ordinary texture, except that it wasn't quite the same as it had been before. The way rooms are never quite the same after something true has been said in them. Eli ate his dinner. He looked at the table in front of him. The key to Bone's greenhouse, a school bus pass from one of the younger members, a paperback book from someone else with a note inside that said, "You seem like you'd like this," a folded piece of paper he hadn't opened yet, and tried to understand what had happened to the boy who'd been sleeping behind an equipment shed in a forgotten park 3 months ago. He was beginning to understand, slowly and with the careful precision he applied to everything, that the boy who'd been invisible was not coming back. He wasn't sure yet who was here in his place. He was starting to think that might be okay. On a Friday morning, 9 weeks after the night in the park, Eli was in Grimm's office, which was less an office than a converted storage room with a desk and 2 chairs and a whiteboard that currently had a route map on it, helping sort through some club administration that had piled up because Grimm had the organizational instincts of someone who was excellent at human management and poor at paperwork, which was a common combination. Grimm was on the phone in the hallway. Eli could hear the conversation without hearing it, the low, authoritative cadence, the monosyllabic responses that punctuated long silences while Grimm listened to whoever was on the other end. The call ended. Grimm came back into the room and sat down heavily. He looked at the whiteboard route map for a moment without seeing it. Something had shifted in his face. Not the emotional rawness of the night in the park, but a different quality, more controlled, more deliberate, the look of someone who has received information and is sorting it. "What is it?" Eli said. Grimm looked at him. "What makes you think it's something?" "You breathe different when something's wrong," Eli said. Grimm looked at him for another moment, and then something moved across his face that might, in different light, have been called a smile. "Ava said that," he said. "She taught me." Grimm was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the desk. He looked at the photograph in the frame. His wife, Eli had understood, though they'd never discussed it directly. He looked at the cracked coffee mug. "The man who took Ava's mother," he said, "is getting out of prison in 30 days. The room changed temperature. Eli said nothing. He had learned in these months the specific value of silence at certain moments. The silence that said, "I am here, I'm listening, I will hold this with you." "He shouldn't be getting out," Grimm continued. His voice was very flat. "He shouldn't have been getting out for another 6 years, but there are lawyers involved and there are processes, and apparently there are things happening that I don't fully understand yet." He looked up. "And this morning, someone sent me a photograph to my personal number, which isn't widely known." He turned his phone and showed Eli the screen. The photograph was from outside Ava's school, taken from across the street. It showed the school entrance at dismissal time. Ava was in the photograph, clearly, recognizably, even at distance, the purple parka visible. She hadn't been alone. Marcus had been with her. Marcus was always with her at dismissal. But whoever had taken this photograph had taken it from a position that made clear they had been watching, that they knew where she went, that they had a phone number they shouldn't have. Eli looked at the photograph and felt something move through him that was very cold and very precise, and not fear exactly. It was related to fear the way that the smoke from a fire is related to the fire, carrying information about it without being the thing itself. "When?" he said. 30 days, Grimm said again. Eli set down the papers he'd been holding. He looked at the man across the desk, the scarred hands, the tired eyes, the vest that bore the weight of everything he'd committed to protect. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Grimm looked back at him. "I don't know yet," Grimm said. And those 4 words from a man who always knew, from the most controlled and prepared man Eli had encountered in his life, was the most frightening thing anyone had said to him in 9 weeks. Outside, somewhere in the parking lot, a Harley turned over and coughed to life, and the sound of it rolled through the building's walls like something between a warning and a heartbeat, and the winter light through the office window was flat and pale and cut no warmth at all. And somewhere in the depths of the building, Ava was laughing at something, the sound of her carrying clear and bright through the walls, and Eli listened to it and understood, in a way that sat in his bones rather than his mind, that everything that had been won in the last 9 weeks was now standing at the edge of something, and that the edge had teeth. He didn't know yet what was coming, but he had been invisible for 14 months, and he had been a scientist all his life, and he had walked across a dark park once towards something every instinct told him to avoid because a little girl needed what he had to offer. He would do it again. Whatever came next, he would do it again. End of part 1. The photograph stayed on the desk between them for a long time. Grimm didn't reach for it. Eli didn't look away from it. The office was small, and the winter light through the single window was doing nothing useful, and outside in the hallway someone walked past with heavy boots, and then the footsteps faded, and there was just the distant sound of the building's ordinary life, voices, the clatter of something in the kitchen, the low-frequency vibration of a Harley idling in the lot. And the 2 of them in the small room with the photograph of Ava standing outside her school on a Tuesday afternoon, taken from across the street by someone who knew where she would be. Grimm picked up the phone, looked at it, set it face down on the desk. "His name is Darren Schultz," he said. "He was my wife's ex-boyfriend before we met. She'd left him 2 years before we got together, and he never—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "He followed her for years. Little things. A flat tire that wasn't an accident. A window at our first apartment that got broken when I was away on a run. She never told me how bad it was until after." He looked at the window. The night he finally came for her, Ava was in the house. 2 years old. She was asleep in her room. Eli said nothing. "He didn't hurt Ava," Grimm continued. His voice had gone to a register that was below emotion, below anything that could be disrupted by feeling, the voice of a man reciting facts he has recited to himself 1,000 times in the dark. He didn't even know she was there. It was between him and Claire. And Claire, the name came out of him like something he was pressing against a wound. Claire didn't survive it. The winter light was very flat and very cold. "He got 12 years, Grimm said. "They said 12 years. That was 4 years ago. He's been— I was told, I had someone watching it. I was told it would be the full 12. And then this morning," he tapped the face-down phone once, "a lawyer named Burwell calls me from a Reno number and tells me there's been a sentence modification. Medical grounds, apparently. Some condition they're citing. He said it as a courtesy call. He stopped. The word courtesy sat in the air between them like something dead. Eli looked at the photograph on the desk. The purple parka. Ava's dark hair. The school entrance. Taken on a Tuesday because Eli knew the schedule. Knew Ava wore that parka on cold days. Knew that Tuesday was the day Ava had her art enrichment class that ran 20 minutes past regular dismissal. "The person who sent this knows her schedule," Eli said. Grimm's eyes moved to him. "The art class runs late on Tuesdays," Eli said. "This was taken Tuesday. You can tell by He gestured at the photograph. "There are fewer kids visible. It's 20 minutes past regular dismissal. So whoever this is, they watched long enough to know the weekly variation." Grimm looked at the photograph with the specific quality of attention of someone revising an assessment. He'd seen it as a photograph. Now he was seeing it as evidence of sustained surveillance. "How long were you watching before you walked toward us in the park?" he asked. 40 minutes, Eli said. "I needed to understand the pattern before I was sure enough to say something." Grimm nodded slowly. There was something in his face that was not quite pride and not quite the complicated unease of a father realizing that the 12-year-old in his household thinks the way a surveillance operative thinks. "I need to know if there's anyone else who knew about the photograph before you made the call to this morning," Eli said. He stopped himself. "Sorry, that's not— You don't have to." "No," Grimm said. "Keep going. The lawyer called you. Did anyone else know you'd received this photograph before you came into the office just now?" "No?" "So it was a coordinated sequence. The legal call first, give you the news about the release, then the photograph, immediately after, before you've had time to react." Eli paused. "Someone wanted you to receive both pieces of information at the same time. Someone wanted you to understand the connection." The room was very quiet. "He's not out yet," Grimm said. "No," Eli agreed, "but someone working with him is." Outside, the idle Harley in the lot revved once and dropped back to idle, and the sound of it moved through the building's walls like a slow exhale. Grimm called church that evening. That was the word they used, church, for the formal assembly of the club's full membership, the meeting behind closed doors where everything of consequence got decided, where the public face of the Iron Veil was set aside, and what remained was 20-some men who had committed to something together and were now accounting to each other for that commitment. Eli was not a member. He was not a prospect. He was 12 years old and had been living in the clubhouse for 2 months and had no formal standing in any of the processes that governed the Iron Veil's collective decisions. He sat in the hallway outside the church room with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up and listened to the vibration of voices through the door without being able to make out words. And this was the correct protocol, and he understood it, and it still required everything he had to sit still and not do something with the information his brain was generating at speed. Ava came and sat next to him. She'd been in her room when church was called. She knew what it meant. knew the geography of it, the closed door and the waiting. She'd done this before, Eli understood. She'd grown up with this. She sat down against the wall beside him with her sketchbook in her lap and didn't ask him anything. After a while, she said, "Did something happen with the man who hurt my mom?" He looked at her. She was looking at her sketchbook, pencil moving, drawing something that was resolving into a detailed rendering of the hallway itself, the floor planks, the door at the end, the light fixture overhead. "Yes," he said. "Is he coming here?" "Not yet." She nodded. The pencil kept moving. "My dad will handle it," she said. Not as reassurance. A statement of observed fact, the way she stated everything, through evidence rather than hope. He always handles it, even when it costs him. Eli thought about the photograph, about the lawyer's courtesy call, about the coordinated timing of it, the specific cruelty of that timing. The legal news first, then the visual evidence designed to maximize the sense of exposure, of vulnerability, of a man who thought his walls were solid being shown exactly where the gaps were. "Ava," he said carefully, "has anything felt different lately? At school, or has anyone you didn't know tried to talk to you, or—" "No." She looked up from the sketchbook. Her eyes, those newly seen gray eyes, found his with a directness that still sometimes caught him off guard, the intensity of someone who'd learned to look with her whole face rather than just her eyes. "Should I be watching for something specific?" He thought about how to answer that. "Just if anything feels off. If someone seems to know things they shouldn't know. If you notice a car that you see more than once." He paused. "You're good at noticing patterns, better than most people. Trust that." She looked at him for another moment and then back at the sketchbook. "You're scared," she said. "Not nervous scared. Different scared." "Yeah." "Okay," she said. And the word meant, "I hear you. I'm taking this seriously. I will not perform calm at the expense of attention." She had a gift for the compressed acknowledgement, for saying more in fewer words than most people managed in paragraphs. She went back to drawing the hallway. The voices behind the church door got louder. Not argumentative loud. This was the particular loud of men in strong agreement, the kind of loud that came when a room found a direction it was willing to commit to. Eli recognized it. He'd been learning to read the acoustic texture of the club's emotional states the way Ava had taught him to read everything else, below the surface of the obvious, in the undertones. Then the volume dropped entirely, and the silence that followed was different from the silence of deliberation. It was the silence of a decision made. The door opened. Grimm came out first, then Marcus, then the rest of them filing out with the particular quiet that follows formal resolution. Heavier in the shoulders, faces set, the specific gravity of men who have just committed to something they understand will cost them. Grimm crouched down in front of Ava. He put his hand on the side of her face with the gentleness that he reserved entirely for her, the only place in his life where that particular tenderness came out, and she leaned into it slightly without looking up from the sketchbook. "You staying here tonight?" he said. "Where else would I be?" "Just checking." He stood. He looked at Eli, and the look carried information in it. Not specifics, not yet, but the acknowledgement that Eli was being included in something, that the calculation had shifted. "Come with me." They went to the office. Grimm left the door open, which Eli had noticed meant, "This is not a closed conversation. This is something I'm willing to have with the building listening." "Schultz has an associate named Trevor Mack," Grimm said. He stood at the whiteboard and erased the route map and picked up the marker. He wrote the name. Mack was never charged with anything connected to Claire's case. He was Schultz's neighbor, not a friend exactly, the way Schultz had it, more of a man who did things in exchange for money and didn't ask about the shape of the things. He wrote Mack under Schultz. "Mack's been in Reno for the last 6 months. He's been seen twice near the school." Eli looked at the whiteboard. "By whom?" "A prospect named Denny. He does a lot of driving. He started noticing a gray Chevy Silverado in the school district neighborhood. Didn't connect it to anything, just filed it away. That's what good eyes do." Grimm glanced at him when he said that. He brought it to Marcus last week when he saw it a third time. Marcus ran the plates. "Mac. Did Denny follow the truck?" "Once. It went back to a motel on the south side. Budget extended stay, cash check-in. Eli looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the two names and the space between them and tried to construct the architecture of what was being planned from the available evidence. A man in prison with 30 days left in a sentence that had been cut from 12 years to 4 by a medical condition whose details hadn't been shared with the man's victim's widower. An associate in Reno for 6 months, watching a school. A photograph sent to a private number the same morning as a lawyer's call. The coordinated timing. The specific selection of Tuesday, with the late class, with the smaller crowd. "He wants her," Eli said. The words came out of him before he'd fully processed them, and he felt the room change around them, felt Grim go very still in the way that the most dangerous things go still before they move. "Say that again," Grim said quietly. "I'm not saying, I don't know his specific plan, but the surveillance this isn't the pattern of someone planning to confront you directly. You're a risk to him. He knows what you are, what the club is. He wouldn't come at you directly. But Ava..." Eli stopped. He made himself finish the thought because the alternative was leaving it unspoken, and leaving it unspoken was not useful. Ava is the thing he knows you can't rationalize, the thing you can't outmaneuver emotionally. If he takes her, or if he just threatens her in a way that's credible, he has something. He has leverage. Grim's face during all of this was a landscape that Eli was still learning to read. The surface of it was controlled, almost blank, the mask of a man who had learned early that showing what something cost you was a form of weakness in the world he inhabited. But underneath, in the set of the jaw, in the particular tension across his shoulders, in the way his hands were very still at his sides rather than moving the way they usually did, underneath was something that Eli recognized without being able to name, because he'd felt it himself during the 14 months in the park, when the temperature dropped and the sleeping bag wasn't enough, and the night stretched out endlessly, and there was nothing between him and the cold but his own will. It was the feeling of a person who has been protecting something with everything they have and has just understood that everything they have might not be sufficient. "That's what I think too," Grim said. His voice was very flat. "That's what church agreed on tonight." He set down the marker. "We're putting a protection detail on her. Permanent, rotating. She doesn't go anywhere without 2 club members. School, the store, the park, nowhere. We're reaching out to our contacts at the county sheriff's office about the sentence modification. See if there's a legal mechanism to challenge it or at least delay it." He paused. "And we're watching Mac." "What does watching Mac mean?" "It means we know where he is and we know what he does. And if he makes a move toward Ava or toward this building or toward anyone connected to this club, we will know about it approximately 30 seconds after it happens." The specificity of this was not a threat and not a boast. It was information delivery. What it doesn't mean is that we touch him preemptively. We are not going to touch him first. I need that to be clear. "Why are you telling me this?" Eli asked. Grim looked at him for a long moment. "Because you live here," he said. "Because Ava trusts you in a way she doesn't trust most people, and that means you are a variable in this situation, whether we formally acknowledge it or not. Because you are 12 years old and you think like..." He stopped. "Because you're going to notice things regardless of whether I tell you or not, and I'd rather you notice them with context than without it." He crossed his arms. "And because the photograph was taken on a Tuesday, and you were the one who told me what Tuesday meant." Eli nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Exactly what you've been doing," Grim said. "Pay attention. Tell me what you see. Don't act on it yourself." He paused, and the pause had something in it that was not quite a warning and not quite a request. "I mean that last part." "I understand," Eli said. The office was quiet for a moment. "Go to bed," Grim said. "School tomorrow." Eli went to bed. He lay in the dark in the room at the end of the hall with his eyes open and listened to the buildings settle and the wind come off the desert and the distant sound of traffic on the county road, and tried to make his brain stop doing what it was doing, which was running probability trees on scenarios he had no control over, which was building contingency frameworks for situations he'd been explicitly told were not his responsibility, which was being 12 years old and having a brain that refused to recognize the limitations that were supposed to come with that. He didn't sleep for a long time. When he did, he dreamed about the park. The first crack showed up 9 days later, and it didn't come from outside. It came from within. It started with a man named Cord. Cord was 37 years old and had been with the Iron Veil for 6 years, a road captain who ran the club's Western Route logistics with the mechanical precision of someone whose military background, 2 years in the Army, administrative discharge that he never discussed, the reason for which was known to Grimm and Marcus and nobody else, expressed itself in relentless organizational competence. He was not a warm man. He was efficient and physically imposing, and he had opinions about protocol that he held with a firmness bordering on religious conviction. And one of those opinions, voiced twice in church and once to Grimm privately in the preceding 2 months, was that having an unvetted minor living in the clubhouse was a security liability that the club's sentimentality was obscuring its judgment about. Cord had not been hostile to Eli directly. He'd been something more uncomfortable, professionally courteous, technically correct in every interaction, withholding nothing that Eli was owed and offering nothing beyond it. It was the specific treatment of someone who had decided that expressing personal reservations through institutional protocol was cleaner than expressing them personally, and Eli, who noticed everything, had understood this from approximately the 3rd week and had filed it without reacting to it because Cord's professional courtesy had never crossed a line and because the man was entitled to his opinion. 9 days after church, Eli overheard a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. He'd come back from school 20 minutes early. The art enrichment teacher had been ill, and the Tuesday session had been canceled. And he'd gone through the back entrance of the building the way he usually did, through the kitchen, and the conversation in the room off the kitchen was already in progress, and he'd stopped before he rounded the corner because he recognized one of the voices, and his body had understood before his mind caught up that this was not something he should walk into. Cord said, "I'm not questioning what the kid did. I'm questioning what we decided about it." A second voice, younger, that Eli identified as a club member named Reyes. Grimm made the call. Grimm made an emotional call, Cord said, which I understand. I'd have made it too, standing there in that park. I'm not saying the call was wrong in that moment. I'm saying that 6 weeks later, 10 weeks later, we're in a protection crisis with a serious external threat. And the same week this external threat becomes official, it turns out the 12-year-old we've been housing for 2 months has been running security analysis on us. Silence. He identified the Tuesday surveillance pattern, Cord continued. He knew the schedule variables for Ava's school. He noticed things about Mac's positioning that trained eyes missed. The voice was not hostile. It was the voice of someone making a case they'd thought through carefully. I'm asking the question that nobody else wants to ask, which is, what do we actually know about this kid? His mother is dead. He has no family. He's been living rough for over a year. He showed up in a park where the president's daughter happens to be. He noticed something about her eyes that 4 years of specialists missed. He walked up to the most dangerous man in the county and made himself necessary. The word necessary sat in the air. Reyes said, "You think he planned it?" "I think the possibility hasn't been discussed," Cord said. "I think we've been so taken with the story of it that we haven't asked whether the story was constructed." Eli stood very still in the kitchen doorway. His hands were at his sides. The backpack on his back felt very heavy. The kitchen smelled like coffee, and the particular bitter combination of old grease and cigarette smoke that was the permanent bass note of the building. And the fluorescent light above him was buzzing slightly with the frequency it always buzzed at. And all of this was exactly the same as every other afternoon he'd come in through the back, and the conversation around the corner was dismantling something that he hadn't known was load-bearing until he felt it starting to give. He could leave. Go back out the way he'd come. Come in through the front in 20 minutes, loudly, giving them time to finish whatever they were finishing. He stood there. Reyes said, "Grimm's already considered this." "Has he?" I watched his face when the kid was running the analysis on the photograph. That wasn't surprise. That was confirmation of something he'd already clocked. Another silence. "That doesn't settle it," Cord said. "Grimm's judgment is—" He paused. "Grimm's judgment about his daughter is the one area where I'd want a second opinion." "You want to raise this in church?" "I want someone to raise it," Cord said. "If not in church, then privately, directly." The kid deserves that much. To have it asked out loud rather than just sidelined. A pause. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And I'll be the first person to say so. Eli backed out of the kitchen the way he'd come. He went around to the front entrance. He sat on the concrete step outside the front door for a long time in the cold. The Harleys were lined up in the lot, and the afternoon light was hitting their chrome at a low, flat angle, and the wind was picking up off the desert, and he sat there and felt the cold and didn't do anything about it, and thought about what he'd heard with the specific, careful precision he applied to problems he needed to solve. Cord wasn't wrong to ask. That was the thing. That was the thing that made it harder than anything hostile would have been. If Cord had been hostile, if he'd been cruel or dismissive, or had treated Eli the way certain adults in the system had treated him, as a problem to be managed, a liability to be minimized, Eli would have had a framework for it. He'd built strong walls against that kind of thing. The walls were load-bearing. They worked. But Cord was applying reason. Legitimate, careful, institutional reason. And Eli, who prized reason above most things, could not in good conscience dismiss it. The question of whether his arrival was too convenient was one he'd asked himself. In the first weeks, in the room at the end of the hall, lying awake in the warmth and the security that still felt borrowed, he'd asked himself that question from the outside, tried to see himself the way a stranger would see him. An orphaned homeless kid who shows up in a park at night and fixes the president's daughter's eyes, who moves into the clubhouse, who makes himself useful, who becomes, in the word Cord had used, necessary, convenient. The word had the shape of something real. He couldn't prove it wasn't true. He couldn't offer evidence of the absence of a plan because the absence of a plan wasn't something you could display. He could only know what he knew, which was that he'd been sitting on that bench for 3 nights trying to be invisible, and he'd seen the light catch Ava's eyes the way it had once caught his own, and everything he'd done after that had been driven by nothing more engineered than a 12-year-old's inability to sit on information that might help a kid who was hurting. That was the truth. It was also, he understood with a cold clarity, unverifiable. He sat on the step until Marcus came out and found him there. Marcus sat down next to him without asking why he was outside. He produced a cigarette, lit it, drew on it, exhaled into the cold air. They sat together in the wind for a moment. "How much did you hear?" Marcus said. Eli looked at him. "Enough," he said. Marcus nodded. He drew on the cigarette again. He was a man of compact silences, Marcus. He communicated through the precise management of what he said and didn't say, and the silences had specific weights to them. This one had the weight of something he'd already decided how to handle. "Cord's not your enemy," Marcus said. "I know. He's wrong about the specific thing, but the category of question he's asking is legitimate. I know that too." Marcus looked at him. "You're not angry." "I am," Eli said. "Just not at him." He paused. "At the fact that I can't prove it. That there's no way to prove it." "Most true things can't be proven," Marcus said. "Proof is for courts. People who've been paying attention operate on something else." "What does Grimm think?" Eli asked. Marcus drew on the cigarette one last time and pressed the ember out against the step, something he did out of the specific care of a man who had seen what fires started by carelessness looked like. He held the dead cigarette for a moment before pocketing it. "Grimm thinks you're the most useful person in the building who isn't allowed to vote," Marcus said, and stood up. "Come inside. It's cold." The conversation with Cord happened 3 days later. Not in church, not with witnesses. Grimm arranged it, told both of them, separately, to be in the office at 8 in the morning, and when they arrived, Grimm was already there at his desk, and the door was open, and he said, "Sit down, both of you," and left no room for anything else. Cord sat in the chair nearest the door. Eli sat in the other chair. The space between them had a quality to it that Eli was familiar with from his months at the club. It was the space of 2 people whose business with each other had not been finished, and who were in the presence of a third person with the authority to finish it. Grimm looked at Cord first. "You raised a question," he said. "I'm giving you the room to raise it out loud." Cord looked at Eli. Not with hostility, with the carefully maintained neutrality of someone conducting what they've decided is a professional assessment. "I want to know your story," Cord said. "The real one." Start from when your mother died and tell me everything that happened between that moment and the park. The room was quiet. Eli looked at Cord. He thought about the various ways he could respond: the defensive deflection, the controlled minimum disclosure, the appeal to Grimm's prior acceptance as a substitute for directly engaging the challenge. He thought about all of those and set them aside. My mother died in August of last year, he said. Cardiac event. She was 31. She didn't have life insurance, and she didn't have a will, and I didn't have a father on record, so I went into the county system. The first placement was in Sparks. The foster father lost his work contract in October, and the placement ended. I spent 3 weeks in a group facility in Henderson. I left. Left, Cord said. I walked out at 4 in the morning. No one noticed for 6 hours. He said this without judgment. After that, I was on my own. I worked. I had a small amount of money my mother had kept in a shoebox. Enough for a month if I was careful. I learned to be careful. I stayed near library systems because they have heat and bathrooms and internet access. I moved when I needed to. I was in Reno for 3 months before the park. Why that park specifically? The bathroom has running water. There's a sodium light that stays on all night. The shed blocks the north wind. It's 3 miles from the nearest shelter, so nobody from the shelter population was competing for the same space. He paused. And I'd seen the park from the road when I was passing through. I noticed the swing set. I remember thinking, people who bring kids to parks don't usually look for trouble. It felt safer than other options. Cord was quiet for a moment. Did you know who Grimm was before that night? No. Had you seen the Iron Veil before? I'd seen the bikes on the highway. I didn't know the club name. When you walked up to him in the park, what did you think was going to happen? Eli considered this carefully because the honest answer was not a clean one. I thought he might hurt me, he said. I thought it was more likely that he'd just send me away. I thought there was a small chance he'd let me explain. He paused. I thought that even if all of that went wrong, it would have been worth trying, because of what I'd seen in her eyes. Cord looked at him for a long time. Why? He said. The word was not hostile, it was genuinely asking. Because she was 6 years old and she couldn't see, Eli said. That's the whole answer. That's all of it. Grimm had not spoken during any of this. He sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes moving between the two of them, and his expression doing nothing visible at all. Cord leaned back slightly in his chair. He looked at the wall for a moment. He had the specific quality of a man performing an honest reassessment in real time, who hadn't decided the outcome in advance and was willing to let the evidence settle where it settled. I owe you an apology, Cord said. He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without the softening language of someone trying to make it easier to hear. I asked the question because I thought it needed asking. I still think it needed asking, but the answer changes the situation. Eli nodded. I don't want an apology, he said. Cord looked at him. What do you want? Eli thought about that. I want to be useful, he said, in a situation that's actually dangerous. I don't want to be managed out of it because I'm 12. He paused. I notice things. That's not going to stop being true because someone's uncomfortable with it. Something shifted in Cord's face that was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man recognizing something he respects in a form he didn't anticipate. He looked at Grimm. Grimm looked at Cord. He stays, Grimm said. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. And whatever he notices, he brings to me or Marcus. Same protocol as anyone else in this building. Cord nodded once. It was the nod of a man who'd raised his formal objection and been overruled by the correct authority and was now prepared to commit fully to the decision, the kind of professional loyalty that Eli would later understand was one of the things that made Cord, for all his difficult edges, someone the club trusted with its logistics. One other thing, Cord said. He reached into his vest pocket and put something on Grimm's desk. A folded piece of paper. I've been running background on Schultz, on the medical condition they cited for the sentence modification. I have a contact at the county medical examiner's office who knows somebody at the state corrections medical unit. He tapped the paper. The condition is real, he does have it, but the rate of deterioration they cited in the modification application, There are questions about whether the documentation accurately represents the progression. Grimm unfolded the paper. The room was quiet while he read it. Who prepared the modification application? Grimm said. A firm called Vance and Associates. They've done 2 other early release modifications in the last 3 years. Both clients were subsequently involved in incidents. Cord's voice was perfectly level. Both incidents involved people connected to the original victims. Grimm set the paper down. Get me everything you can on Vance and Associates, he said. Everything. Their other cases, their funding, who retained them for this one, how Schultz is paying for it. Already started, Cord said. I'm sure. Mac made his first direct move on a Thursday. Eli was walking the 3 blocks from the bus stop to the clubhouse when he saw the gray Silverado. He saw it the way he saw most things, peripheral, cataloged, cross-referenced against existing data before the conscious mind made its assessment. Gray truck. Nevada plates. Parked on the opposite side of the street from the clubhouse approach road, engine running. He'd never seen the truck before, but the profile of it matched Denny's description. Extended cab, chrome side mirrors, a dent in the front quarter panel on the driver's side. He kept walking. He didn't look at the truck. He walked at exactly the pace he always walked, backpack on, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the sidewalk the way a 12-year-old coming home from school might look at the sidewalk. He was aware of the truck in the same way he was aware of his own heartbeat, as background data, continuously monitored. The truck didn't move. He went into the clubhouse through the front. He found Marcus in the kitchen. He said, "The gray Silverado is on the approach road. Driver's side. Engine running." Marcus set down his coffee. He went to the window. He looked. He picked up his phone. 4 minutes later, Denny and another member named Vickers were out the back, moving around the block on foot by 2 different routes. Marcus watched the window. Eli stood back from the window and watched Marcus's face and read the situation from the micro-expressions of a man with combat experience tracking a potential threat. The truck moved before Denny and Vickers could get eyes on the driver. It pulled out of the parking spot and drove north on the county road at normal speed and turned east and was gone. Marcus lowered his phone. "He's testing response time," he said. "Yes," Eli said. Marcus looked at him. "You walked past that truck. He saw you." "Yes." "You understand what that means?" "It means he knows I live here. It means he's now added me to his read of the household." Eli paused. "Which means he's been watching long enough to know I'm a regular, but not long enough to know exactly who I am to Grimm." Marcus's jaw worked slightly. "From here on," Marcus said, "you don't walk from the bus stop alone." "I know," Eli said. "I mean it." "Marcus." He looked at him steadily. "I know." The days that followed had the quality of a held breath. The protection detail on Ava tightened. 2 club members at all times, a rotation that Grimm managed personally. No gaps, no exceptions. The surveillance on the motel where Mac was staying intensified. Cord's investigation into Vance and Associates was producing information that was moving in directions Grimm was not sharing widely, but that were visible in the increasing frequency of closed-door conversations and the specific quality of tension in the office where they happened. Eli went to school. He came home. He sat with Ava in the evenings and didn't tell her what he was thinking because what he was thinking was not appropriate for a 6-year-old, even a 6-year-old with Ava's specific precision and emotional intelligence. He told her about his day at school. He listened to her describe the colors she'd been painting. He helped her with a project on ecosystems that she was doing for her class, and they spent an evening going through library books looking at photographs of the Mojave Desert, and Ava kept stopping to hold the books up to the light and look at the photographs with the focused intensity of someone who couldn't take any image for granted, not even a picture of a cactus. He was in the kitchen at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, couldn't sleep again, making tea with the systematic distraction of someone trying to give their hands something to do. When Grimm came in, Grimm sat at the kitchen table. He was still in his vest, which meant he'd been somewhere, which Eli knew better than to ask about directly. He poured Grimm coffee from the pot without being asked, set it in front of him. Grimm wrapped both hands around the mug. "The lawyer," Grimm said. "Burwell. The one who called me about the sentence modification." He looked at the table. He has a daughter. She's 17. She goes to school 4 miles from here. Eli sat down across from him. Cord found this? He asked. This morning. Does Burwell know Schultz personally, or was this just a professional referral? That's what I need to know. Grimm drank the coffee, set the mug down. The firm that retained Burwell, Vance and Associates, they were paid through a holding company. The holding company is 6 months old. The name on the registration documents is a woman named Patricia Schultz. His sister? Mother. Grimm's voice was flat. She's 73 years old and lives in Boise and has no known criminal history and is, according to everything Cord has found, genuinely just a woman who believes her son is sick and is using her savings to help him get out of prison. He paused, which makes her a victim of this too, in a way, which makes this entire thing. He stopped. Harder, Eli said. Everything always gets harder, Grimm said, not with self-pity, with the specific acknowledgement of a man who has been doing this long enough to understand that the straight line between problem and solution rarely exists, and that the work happens in the complicated middle, in the moral geography that resists simplification. They sat with their respective drinks, and the kitchen was warm, and the building was settling into its late-night quiet around them, and outside the wind was doing what it always did, which was to come off the desert without apology and remind you that Nevada was mostly emptiness, and that Reno was just the part of that emptiness where people had decided to put lights. What's your plan? Eli said. Grimm looked at him with the evaluating expression that Eli had learned to read as genuine consideration rather than dismissal. We're meeting with Burwell tomorrow, Grimm said. Not the club. Me, Marcus, and Cord. We're going to his office professionally, and we're going to explain the situation to him and give him the opportunity to extricate himself from whatever Schultz is using him for. What if he's not willing to extricate himself? Grimm picked up the mug again. Then we find out how committed he is, he said. Eli thought about the 17-year-old daughter, about the way this situation was radiating outward from its center, the way damage always radiated, touching people who had nothing to do with the original wound and dragging them into the gravity of it. There's something else, Grimm said. His voice had changed. The operational flatness was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that Eli had learned to recognize as the register Grimm used when he was saying something that cost him to say. Schultz's medical condition, Grimm said, the pulmonary thing they cited. Cord talked to a doctor yesterday, a real one, not connected to corrections. Described the progression documentation from the modification application. He set down the mug. The doctor said that based on what Cord described, the patient would have a life expectancy, untreated in a low-care environment, of somewhere between 18 months and 3 years. Eli absorbed this. So he's dying, he said. Probably. And he wants to use whatever time he has left to... Eli stopped. He looked at the table. The implication assembled itself with a cold precision that he recognized from the probability trees he'd been running in the dark in his room for the past 3 weeks. He doesn't want leverage, Eli said slowly. He doesn't want a negotiation. If he's dying on a timeline like that, he's not planning for after. He's planning for... He looked up. Grimm was looking at him with an expression that confirmed what he was thinking. He wants to take something with him, Eli said. The words came out very quiet. He wants... not leverage, not a trade. He wants to take something from you that you can't get back. Something that... He stopped again because the thought had reached its destination, and the destination was Ava, 6 years old, 2 months of sight, purple parka, hand in his on the way home from school. We think so, Grimm said. Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. Eli sat with what he'd just understood and felt it settle into his bones the way real fear settles, different from the situational fear of immediate threat, deeper and colder than that. The fear that lives in the future you're trying to prevent. Then 30 days isn't 30 days, he said. No, Grimm said. He could move any time. The 30 days is the legal minimum we know about. But he's not. If he's not planning to run afterward, if he's not planning to survive this, then the legal timeline is irrelevant. Yes, Grimm said. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere in the building's weather stripping, and for a moment the cold got in. That particular edge of Nevada winter that cut through even warm rooms if it found a crack. And Eli felt it on the back of his neck and didn't move, and looked at Grim and understood with absolute clarity that the 30-day bracket they'd all been operating within had just ceased to exist. Grim's phone lit up on the table between them. He looked at the screen. Something in his face contracted. A single sharp compression, like a body-absorbing impact, and then went very still. He turned the phone so Eli could see the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. It said, "Tell the boy that the park is a dangerous place to sit alone at night. He should be more careful." The message had a timestamp of 10:47 p.m. Eli had left the park at 10:45 p.m. 3 days ago. He had been alone for 4 minutes, between Denny's departure and Vickers' arrival, while they changed the rotation. 4 minutes. Someone had been in the park. Someone had been watching him, specifically, knowing his name, knowing he was connected to Grim, and had waited 3 days before sending this message. 3 days of knowing they had information. 3 days of choosing when to use it. Grim's hand was flat on the table. His knuckles were white. "Go to your room," he said. His voice was the voice from underneath all the other voices, the one with nothing above it, nothing managing it. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone except me or Marcus." Eli stood up. "Grim." "Now," Grim said. He went. In the hallway, moving toward the back of the building, he heard Grim's voice behind him already, low and rapid, talking to someone on the phone, and the tone of it was a frequency he hadn't heard before. The specific compressed urgency of a man whose patience for managing the situation carefully had just run out, and Eli understood. Walking down that dark hallway to the room at the end of it, and the lock that worked and the warmth inside it, that something had just ended and something else had just begun. The lock on his door was a deadbolt, and Eli turned it and stood with his back against the door in the dark and listened to the building come alive around him. It happened fast. The way it always happened when Grim made a call. The specific acceleration of a household that had trained for this, that knew the difference between ordinary late-night sounds and the sounds of the machinery engaging. Boots in the hallway. Voices low and clipped. The particular sequence of the armory cabinet opening and closing. The sound of it familiar now in the way all sounds in this building had become familiar, cataloged, and understood. Someone running. Someone else not running, but moving with the compressed speed of a person who had decided that running was for people who hadn't thought far enough ahead. Eli stood in the dark and breathed and tried to think. The text message. "Tell the boy that the park is a dangerous place to sit alone at night." Someone had been in the park 3 days ago. Someone who knew his name, knew his connection to Grim, knew his schedule, knew the 4-minute gap in the rotation, and had waited 3 days. That was the part that kept snagging in his mind, the 3-day delay, because it wasn't operational. If the goal was to take him, the park was the moment, the 4-minute gap was the window, and they hadn't used it. They'd used it for something else. They'd used it to demonstrate that they could. It was a message. Not a threat of future action, a demonstration of existing capability, which meant Schultz already had everything he needed. The realization landed cold and hard in Eli's chest. He turned on the lamp beside his bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress and put his hands flat on his knees and made his breathing regular and thought it through with everything he had. If Schultz already had the capability, if he'd been able to get eyes on Eli in the park undetected for 4 minutes 3 days ago, then the protection detail on Ava, the rotation schedule, the watched motel where Mac was staying, all of it was based on a threat model that was already out of date. They'd been watching Mac. They'd been tracking the gray Silverado. They'd been building their understanding of the threat around Trevor Mack as the primary instrument, but Mac was the visible piece. Mac was the piece they were supposed to be watching. Eli stood up. He crossed the room to the small desk. He opened the notebook he kept there and found a blank page and wrote 2 words. "Who else?" Underlined them both. He was still staring at those words when his door shook with 3 hard knocks. "It's Marcus. Open up." He unlocked the door. Marcus came in and closed it behind him. He was in full vest, a tension across his shoulders that Eli had seen on him exactly once before, the night Grimm had called church. He looked at the notebook on the desk and then at Eli. "Mac's not at the motel," Marcus said. "He checked out 6 hours ago, paid cash for 2 extra nights to make it look occupied. Housekeeping noticed the room was empty an hour ago." He paused. "We don't know where he is." "He's not working alone," Eli said. "No." "The park. 3 days ago, that wasn't Mac. Mac's been watched. Whoever was in the park, we don't have eyes on." Marcus looked at him. "Grimm's already thinking the same thing," Marcus said, "but there's something else." He pulled out his phone, showed Eli a photograph on the screen. Not the school photograph, a new one. A surveillance image, grainy, timestamp in the corner. It showed a man Eli didn't recognize entering the side door of the clubhouse building. The timestamp read 47 minutes ago. The side door. The one that was supposed to require a code. "Someone gave him the code," Eli said. "The code changed 4 days ago," Marcus said, "after Grimm's phone call. Only 12 people have the new code." The room got very quiet. 12 people. The inner circle of the Iron Veil. Men who had been with this club for years, who had built it, who bled for it, and one of them had handed Schultz's associate the door code to the building where Ava slept. "Is Ava—" Eli started. "Denny's with her. 2 locks. He's been told not to move from that room for anything." Marcus's jaw was tight. "But Eli, the man in this photograph, we've identified him." He took the phone back. "His name is Carl Reyes." Eli stared at him. Reyes, the man who'd been in the kitchen with Cord, the younger voice. Grimm made the call. "He's been with the club for 3 years, Marcus said. "He came in on Cord's recommendation. Military background, solid record, no flags." He put the phone away. Cord is having a very hard night." Eli thought about the kitchen conversation, about Cord's careful institutional voice raising legitimate questions about a homeless kid who'd shown up in a park, about Reyes sitting beside him, answering, steering, about how a conversation that looked like one man's professional concern could also be reconnaissance, finding out exactly how much Grimm trusted the boy, exactly what the boy had access to, exactly where the gaps in the household's awareness were. "He was reporting to Schultz the whole time," Eli said. "For 3 years, Marcus said. "We think he was recruited before he joined the club. We think the plan was always long-term. We think—" He stopped. He had the expression of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been completely rewritten and who is processing the scale of what that means. "We think this started before Claire died, before any of it." The cold from outside was getting in through the window seal, and Eli stood in it and felt it on his face and thought about 3 years of patient infiltration, of a man sitting at the long table on Thursday nights eating with the brotherhood, sleeping under the same roof, holding the trust of people who had built their entire world on the specific currency of earned loyalty, and using all of it to feed information to the man who had killed their president's wife. "Where's Reyes now?" Eli said. "We have him," Marcus said. "He's in the garage." The garage was at the back of the property, a separate structure connected to the main building by a covered walkway, and the fluorescent lights inside it threw everything into the flat white exposure of a room where there was nowhere to hide. 4 bikes were in there, 2 of them mid-repair, tools spread on the concrete floor. The smell was oil and cold metal, and the particular sharpness of tension that accumulated in enclosed spaces when men under severe strain were pressed close together. Reyes was sitting on a workbench with Marcus and Cord, and 2 others standing around him and Grimm in front of him, and the configuration of the room communicated everything about the power structure without requiring any statement of it. Eli stopped in the doorway. Marcus had said he could come. He hadn't been invited in. Reyes looked bad. Not physically. He was intact. Nobody had touched him. That was visible immediately. He looked bad in the way people look when the architecture they've been living inside has just come down and they're standing in the open for the first time, exposed to weather they'd been protected from by the structure of their lie. Grimm was not speaking. He was standing in front of Reyes with his arms at his sides and the stillness that was his most dangerous register, the stillness of something that had made its decision and was now just determining sequence. The code, Grimm said finally. One word. One word that contained a whole indictment. Reyes looked at the floor. It wasn't supposed to go this way, Reyes said. I'm not interested in what it was supposed to do, Grimm said. I'm interested in where Mac is right now. I don't know. Reyes. I gave him the code. That's all he asked for. He said he just needed to confirm the layout, confirm the entry points. He wasn't going to... He stopped. His voice was cracking in the specific way voices crack, when the speaker knows the words they're saying are inadequate to the crime being described. He said nobody was going to get hurt. Cord made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something that was already broken gets broken further. He said it was about leverage, Reyes continued. That Schultz needed Grimm to make a decision about something. A property matter, a financial thing. He said if Grimm agreed to sign something, everything would stop. Nobody would be touched. What something? Grimm said. Reyes finally looked up. His face was the face of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long, and has just put it down, and is discovering that putting it down doesn't make it lighter, just makes it visible. Schultz has a claim, Reyes said, on the building, on this building. He says, his lawyer says, that when Claire died, there was a co-ownership arrangement that was never legally dissolved. That the building is... He stopped again. He says it's half his, through Claire. The garage was completely silent. Eli, in the doorway, understood the shape of it. Not the legal details, not the specifics. Those were for lawyers and courts and processes he had no expertise in, but the shape. The man who had taken Claire had apparently also had a claim on something she'd owned, something that passed through her death into legal ambiguity, and he'd spent 4 years in prison developing a plan that used that claim as the blade and his own dying body as the handle, because a dying man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous kind of instrument. The property was Claire's before we met, Grimm said. His voice had gone to the flat register again. She bought it with inheritance from her father, her name and mine on the deed after we married. He looked at Reyes, and the look was the entirety of everything he felt, compressed into something he could not yet afford to release. There is no co-ownership with Schultz. There was never anything between them that constituted... His lawyer says there was a common law arrangement, Reyes said quietly. Before you. Before she left him. 2 years, same address. In Nevada that carries... I know what it carries in Nevada, Grimm said. The cold got into the garage through the gap under the rolling door and moved across the floor like something looking for a place to settle. The fluorescent light buzzed. Somewhere outside, far off, a Harley on the highway. Someone's, nobody's. The sound of the road at midnight carrying through the desert cold. Grimm turned away from Reyes. He faced the wall. His hands were at his sides, and they were not fist. That was the thing. They were open, flat, the specific controlled stillness of a man who has not yet decided what his hands are for. Cord stepped forward. He put his hand on Grimm's shoulder. One hand, briefly, a contact that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and then was removed. The language of men who did not have a long vocabulary for this kind of thing, but had developed the specific shorthand of it through years of proximity. Grimm turned back. He looked at Reyes with the expression of a man closing a door. "Where is Mac tonight?" he said. "Right now. I'm asking once more." Reyes looked at him. Something moved through his face, guilt, fear, the remnant of something that might once have been loyalty before it was corrupted. And he said, "He mentioned a secondary location, a storage unit off Interstate 80, east of town. He said if anything went wrong at the motel, that's where he'd be." Grimm nodded. He turned to Marcus. Something passed between them that needed no words. Marcus moved toward the door. He looked at Eli as he passed, and the look said, "Stay close, stay quiet, stay safe." All 3 things, in that order. Grimm stopped at the garage doorway. He didn't turn around. "Cord," he said. "Yes." "Take care of this." He meant Reyes. He meant the situation. He meant all of it. He walked out into the cold. Eli followed. Outside, the night was absolute. Black sky, hard stars. The desert wind coming in from the east carrying nothing but distance and cold. Grim walked toward the main building, and Eli fell into step beside him, and neither of them spoke for 20 feet, 30. And then Grim stopped walking and stood in the cold with his face turned slightly away and his breath making small clouds in the dark, and Eli stopped beside him and waited. "She never told me about the co-ownership claim," Grim said. His voice was quiet. Not broken, something underneath broken, something that had been broken for 4 years and was now being broken again at a different angle. "She was trying to protect me from it. She knew he would use it. She knew he'd been building toward something, and she was trying to—" He stopped. Eli stood in the cold and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would be adequate to a man discovering that the woman he'd loved had spent the last years of her life carrying a weight she hadn't let him share, because she'd been trying to keep him from the path of it, and the path had found them anyway. "We have 30 days on paper," Grim said. "We have nothing in reality. He's already here. His people are already inside." He turned and looked at Eli, and the look had something in it that Eli had never seen on this man's face before. The look of someone who has run all the options and found the inventory inadequate. "And the one thing I cannot, the one thing I will not, is let him near her." "Then we don't let him near her," Eli said. Grim looked at him. "I'm 12, Eli said, "and I know that. You taught me that. By example, every single day in this building." He held the man's gaze. "We don't let him near her." For a long moment they stood in the Nevada cold with the stars overhead and the building behind them and the weight of what they knew pressing down. And then Grim's phone lit up again, a number Eli didn't recognize, and Grim looked at the screen, and the blood left his face in a single motion the way color leaves a thing when the light goes out, and he turned the screen toward Eli with a hand that was no longer steady. It was a photograph. Ava's room. Taken from outside her window, through the glass. Denny visible in the background at the door, facing the wrong direction, and Ava's empty bed. End of part 3. Grim was already moving before Eli could process the photograph. Not running. Something faster than running. The compressed forward motion of a man who has converted every available resource into a single direction, who has nothing left that isn't pointed at the same place. He hit the back door of the main building at full stride, and Eli was 3 steps behind him, and the door swung open, and they were inside, and Grim was already on the phone, already talking, already building the response, while his boots ate the hallway floor. "Ava's room, now, everyone." Denny was in the hallway outside Ava's door when they got there, standing with the specific expression of a man who has just understood the magnitude of his failure and is still catching up to it. The door behind him was open. The room was exactly as the photograph showed it. Lamp on, bed empty, window on the far wall showing the dark outside and nothing else. Grim went through the door. He crossed to the window in 4 steps. The latch was intact. It hadn't been forced from outside. He turned, scanned the room. His eyes landed on the desk. A piece of paper. Folded once. He picked it up. Read it. His face did nothing visible, which was the most frightening thing Eli had seen in this entire night. He held the paper out without looking up. Eli took it. She walked out herself. "She's safe. She'll stay safe as long as you come alone to the storage facility on 80. Unit 14. You have 40 minutes. You bring anyone, she stops being safe. D.S. Darren Schultz." Eli read it twice. His brain was already pulling it apart. She walked out herself meant she'd been contacted somehow, convinced somehow. There was communication he hadn't known about, a channel into this room that wasn't the window and wasn't the door. And then he understood, looking at Ava's desk, at the small secondary phone that sat there, the cheap prepaid he and Grim had bought her so she could call from school in emergencies. The number was known only to Grim and Eli and the school's front office, except Reyes had been in this building for 3 years. Reyes had known about the phone. "He's been talking to her," Eli said. His voice came out very flat. "Through the emergency phone. He convinced her. He told her something that made her go voluntarily." He looked at Grim. "What could he tell a 6-year-old that would make her walk out of a locked room in the middle of the night?" Grim's jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes that was the answer to that question. Something that connected to what Eli already knew about Ava, about her specific emotional architecture, about the one vulnerability in a child that Perceptive was always going to have. He told her about her mother, Grimm said. The hallway had filled. Marcus and Cord and Bone and 6 others, Leather and Exhaust, and the particular electric stillness of men waiting for direction, charged and controlled. They'd read the room. They were quiet. He told her something about Claire, Grimm continued, his voice steady, with the terrible steadiness of effort. Something that would make her feel like she needed to go, like there was something she could do. He looked at the note again. She's 6 years old and she's brave, and she thinks the world is manageable because for 2 months it has been, and he knew exactly what lever to pull. Cord said, "We go." He said alone, Grimm said. He said you go alone, Cord said. He didn't say anything about what exists between here and there. Grimm looked at him. He's dying, Grimm said. He has nothing to lose. If he sees vehicles, he won't see vehicles, Marcus said. The certainty in his voice was not bravado. It was operational. He'll see one man walking into Unit 14. What he won't see is everything else. 40 minutes. The clock was already running. Grimm looked at the note one more time. Then he folded it and put it in his vest and looked at Marcus. And something passed between them that was the compressed language of 20 years, of every hard decision they'd made together, of every time one of them had stood at an edge and the other had been the reason they didn't go over it alone. 38 minutes, Marcus said. Let's move. Interstate 80 east of Reno ran through the kind of industrial corridor that existed in most American cities as the honest infrastructure behind the attractive face. Storage facilities and salvage yards and trucking depots, and the flat pragmatic architecture of commerce that didn't need to be beautiful because nobody was supposed to look at it. The storage complex was set back from the road behind a chain-link fence, 12 rows of orange rolling doors under sodium lights, the asphalt cracked and weeded through, one security light at the entrance buzzing with the frequency of something that had been failing for months and hadn't been replaced. Unit 14 was in the 3rd row, middle section, away from the entrance lights. In the dark, it was just an orange door and a combination lock, and the smell of concrete and cold and motor oil that all storage units shared. Grimm parked the truck on the service road that ran along the complex's east edge. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and the engine off and looked at the unit through the chain link. Eli was in the passenger seat. He hadn't been invited. He'd gotten in the truck while Grimm was briefing Marcus, and nobody had told him to get out. And when Grimm had come around to the driver's side and seen him there, he'd looked at Eli for 3 full seconds and then gotten in without speaking, which was the same as permission. "You stay in the truck," Grimm said now. "Yes, sir." "I mean it." "I know." Grimm looked at the unit. "If this goes wrong, it won't." Eli. The name, just the name, the specific weight he gave it, when he was saying something that needed to be received fully. "If this goes wrong, you go to Marcus. You don't come in. You don't try to. You go to Marcus and you let the people who are built for this handle it." Eli looked at him. He thought about the park, about the 40 minutes he'd sat watching before he walked forward, about every moment in the past 2 months that had been building toward this specific night and this specific truck and this specific man about to walk through a chain-link gate to get his daughter back from someone who was dying and had decided to spend that dying badly. "I understand," Eli said. Grimm got out of the truck. He walked through the gate. He walked the service road between the rows with the specific unhurried gravity of a man who has made peace with the next 5 minutes regardless of what they contain. His boots on the cracked asphalt were the only sound in the complex. The sodium light at the entrance was behind him now, throwing his shadow long and forward. He stopped in front of Unit 14. The combination lock was open, hanging loose from the latch. He pulled the rolling door up. The interior of the storage unit was lit by a single battery lantern hung from the shelf rail, throwing warm amber light that made the concrete walls look almost hospitable. It was maybe 10 feet deep, 8 feet wide, stacked on the sides with plastic bins and an old workbench along the back wall. Ava was sitting on the workbench. She was in her pajamas and her socks, and she had her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. And her face, when the door went up and the outside air came in, turned immediately toward Grimm with the precision of someone who had been listening for that specific sound for however long she'd been sitting in the dark. "Dad," she said. He crossed the unit in 3 steps and picked her up and held her against him with both arms, and she wrapped herself around his neck and held on, and he stood there in the amber light with his eyes closed and his daughter pressed against his chest and breathed. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "You're cold." "Yeah." He pulled back and looked at her face, running his hands over her, checking with the systematic thoroughness of a father who has been running on terror for 40 minutes and needs evidence before he can stop. She was intact. She was cold and tired, and her eyes were wide, and she had clearly been crying at some point but was not crying now, was doing what she always did under pressure, which was attend, orient, process. "There was a man," she said. "He called me on my phone. He said he knew something about Mom. He said if I came here, he'd tell me." She looked at Grim with those open gray eyes, and in them was the specific expression of a 6-year-old who has just understood that she was used, that her love for something was turned into a handle, and someone grabbed it. "I'm sorry, Dad. I thought—" "You don't apologize," Grim said. "Not for this. Not ever for this." The sound behind them was what Eli heard from the truck. A single footstep on concrete, deliberate, announcing itself. Darren Schultz stepped out of the shadows at the side of the unit. He was not what Eli had constructed in his mind. He was smaller than expected. Mid-50s, gray, thin in the specific way of someone whose body was consuming itself. The pallor of someone whose oxygenation was compromised, breathing with the slight labored quality of a man for whom air had become effortful. He was not physically imposing. He had nothing in his hands. He looked at Grim holding Ava, and his face had the expression of a man who has been running on a single feeling for 4 years and is now standing inside the moment he built that feeling toward, and the feeling was doing something complicated and insufficient now that it was here. "She should know," Schultz said. His voice was thin, slightly wet. "About her mother. About what Claire—" "No," Grim said. She deserves nothing from you." The words were not loud. They were the flattest, most absolute thing Eli had ever heard come out of a human being. "You don't get to talk about what she deserves." Schultz looked at Ava. Ava was looking at him with her whole face, the full open attention that she gave to everything, reading him the way she read everything, and whatever she was reading was resolving in her expression into something that was not fear but was related to it, the recognition of something damaged beyond reclamation. "I'm sick," Schultz said, as if this were relevant, as if this changed a weight on a scale somewhere. "I know," Grim said. I'm not here to hurt anyone." His breathing had the catch in it now, audible, the sound of lungs doing insufficient work. "I wanted her to know about her mother, that Claire, that when we were together she was—" He stopped. He was looking at Ava still, and his eyes had something in them that had once been love, and had curdled into something that had the shape of love, but none of the function. "She was the best thing I ever had, and I destroyed it, and I needed—" "You needed," Grim said. The 2 words landed like a verdict. Schultz went quiet. Outside at the edge of Eli's hearing, the sound arrived like weather. Multiple engines, low, running without headlights. The specific rumble of Harleys moving at the particular speed of people who know exactly where they're going and have decided to announce themselves on their own terms. The sound of it moved through the storage complex and off the chain-link fence and into the unit, and Schultz heard it and understood what he was hearing and looked at Grim. "You brought them," he said. "They came," Grim said. "There's a difference." Schultz's eyes moved to the entrance of the unit, the dark beyond the door. The sound of the engines growing, not hurrying, just arriving with the patient inevitability of something that has decided its own pace. He looked back at Grim, at Ava in his arms, at the 6-year-old girl who had been born into a world she couldn't see and had spent 2 months now learning its colors and had just spent 40 minutes in a cold storage unit because this man had reached into her love for her dead mother and pulled. "She has her mother's eyes," Schultz said. The sentence was the last thing he said before Grim set Ava down and told her to look at the wall. And she did, without question, because she trusted him. And what happened in the next 90 seconds in the amber light of the storage unit was not something Eli saw. He heard it. Sitting in the truck with his hands flat on his knees and his breath fogging the cold glass, He heard the specific quality of a confrontation that didn't require weapons. The low voices, a single sharp sound that was not a blow, but the impact of truth delivered without softening, and then a long silence, and then nothing. And then Grimm walking out of the unit with Ava against his chest, and her face buried in his neck, and his own face carrying the expression of a man who has set something down that he has been holding for 4 years and will not pick up again. Schultz walked out behind him. He walked to the chain-link fence and sat down against it in the cold and didn't look at anyone. He was breathing badly. His hands were in his lap. He looked like what he was, a man at the end of something, past the point where defiance was available to him, past the point where anything was available except the cold concrete and the failing lungs and the specific accounting that happens when everything you've built toward turns out to be ash. Marcus materialized from the dark with 4 others. The Harleys had gone silent. The men stood in the storage complex's amber light and said nothing and did nothing, and the doing nothing was its own statement, the specific, deliberate restraint of people who could have done otherwise and were choosing not to, not from weakness, but from the understanding that some things didn't need their hands. 2 county sheriff's deputies arrived 11 minutes later. Cord had made a call. The contacts Grimm had mentioned, the ones they'd been cultivating around the sentence modification. Whatever conversation Cord had in those 11 minutes, it was sufficient. Schultz was taken without incident. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He went into the back of the deputy's vehicle with the cooperative exhaustion of someone who had burned through everything they had, and was now simply waiting for whatever came next. Eli watched from the truck until the vehicle's taillights disappeared north on the service road. Then he got out. The diner was called Marisol's, and it sat on the county road 2 miles from the storage complex, and it was the kind of place that existed specifically for 4 in the morning. Harsh fluorescent light, formica tables, a cook in the back who didn't ask questions and kept the coffee coming and understood that the people who arrived at this hour were arriving from somewhere difficult and needed the specific mercy of warmth and something hot and no conversation required. They filled 6 booths. Grimm sat in the corner booth with Ava in his lap, asleep, her head against his chest and her purple pajamaed feet dangling over his knee. He had one arm around her and a coffee mug in his other hand, and he was looking at the table with the specific quality of stillness that comes after sustained adrenaline drains away and leaves the body honest about what it costs. Eli sat across from him. Between them, untouched, was a plate of toast that the waitress had brought without being asked, because she had looked at this table and understood something without needing the details. The toast steamed slightly in the diner's warm air. The coffee was bitter and over-extracted and the best thing Eli had ever tasted. "She told me what he said to her," Grimm said. His voice was low, careful not to disturb Ava's sleep. "On the phone. He told her that her mother had left him a message, before she died, that the message was for Ava, that if Ava came to meet him, he would give it to her." Eli looked at him. "Was there a message?" Grimm was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "There was no message." He looked down at Ava's face, slack with sleep, utterly peaceful, the way children's faces are when they've processed the fear and come through the other side of it intact. Claire would never have sent anything through him. She understood exactly what he was. He touched the side of Ava's face briefly, the back of one scarred finger against her cheek. But Ava didn't know that. "She's 6. She heard a message from your mom, and she went." "You're not angry at her," Eli said. "No." "She walked into it." "She walked into it because she loved her mother," Grimm said. "You don't get angry at a child for loving someone." He looked up. "You make sure the people who exploit that love can't reach her again." Across the diner, Marcus was eating eggs with the methodical focus of someone refueling, his eyes moving occasionally to the door and the windows with the low-level vigilance that Eli understood now would never fully turn off in these men. Was not a symptom, but a feature. The price of attention paid over years in situations that required it. Bone was drinking coffee and staring at nothing with the expression of someone sorting through something internally. Cord sat alone at the counter, elbows on the formica, and Eli watched him for a moment and saw in the set of his shoulders The specific weight of a man reconciling himself to having introduced the person who nearly destroyed everything he'd spent years building, and understanding that this was a debt that had no clean settlement, only the long work of what came after. The diner was warm. Outside, the Nevada night was beginning to make its concessions to morning, the black at the horizon fading by degrees toward something not yet blue but no longer absolute, the suggestion of the desert revealing itself in outline, sage and distance, and the long, flat geometry of a landscape that didn't soften for anyone. Ava stirred. She didn't wake, just shifted, pressing her face more firmly into Grimm's chest and exhaling a small sound that was somewhere between a word and nothing. Grimm adjusted his arm around her without looking down, the automatic fluency of a father's body knowing exactly what was needed before the mind caught up. Eli looked at them. He thought about the park, the sodium light, the 40 minutes on the cold bench before he stood up, the specific calculus of a 12-year-old deciding that the possible cost of walking forward was less than the certain cost of staying still. He thought about the membrane, translucent, nearly invisible unless the light hit it right, that had been sitting against Ava's eyes for 6 years, while specialists looked for something complicated and missed something simple. He thought about the vest, warm from Grimm's body, settled across his thin shoulders in the dark. He thought about his mother's hands, the shoebox, the library card with his name on it that he'd kept because some days that was all he had. He thought about what Ava had said in the hallway. "You're safe too." I could tell in the park. "What happens to Reyes?" he said. "He's out," Grimm said. The simplicity of it was its own completeness. He's out, and he knows why, and there won't be a conversation about it. "And Cord?" Grimm looked at him. "Cord stays," Grimm said. He raised the right question about the wrong person, and he found the thing that nearly broke us, and he'll spend the next 10 years paying for it through the work. That's enough. A pause. "That's how this works. You earn your way back." Eli nodded. The waitress came by and refilled his coffee without asking, and he wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the heat move up through his palms and into his wrists, and thought that this was one of the things he would remember. This specific sensation, this specific temperature, this specific diner at this specific hour with these specific people in the booths around him, all of them carrying their damage and their loyalty in the same bodies, indistinguishable from each other now, his damage and their damage, his loyalty and theirs. Grimm was looking at him. "You got in the truck," he said. "Yes, sir. I told you to stay in the building." "You didn't tell me to stay in the building," Eli said. "You told me not to act on it myself. I didn't act on anything. I sat in the truck." Grimm looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating expression that Eli had stopped being unsettled by weeks ago, because he understood now that it was not judgment, but attention, the specific quality of being fully seen by someone who was paying the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they had decided mattered. "Yeah," Grimm said. "You did." Ava opened her eyes. She blinked at the diner ceiling with the gradual focusing of a child returning from deep sleep, taking inventory, the light, the warmth, the smell of coffee and bacon grease, and the particular dense comfort of a crowded room. She turned her face and found Eli across the table and looked at him with those open gray eyes. "You came," she said. Not surprised, just confirming. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for another moment with the complete steady attention that was the most purely Ava thing about her, the quality that had survived 6 years of darkness and 2 months of sight and 1 terrible night in a cold storage unit, the quality that Eli thought would probably survive most things. And then she reached across the table and put her small hand over his. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Outside, the first Harley turned over in the parking lot. Someone heading back, the sound of it moving through the pre-dawn cold and fading east, absorbed by the desert's enormous indifference to human noise. Then another. Then the low collective rumble of several engines finding their rhythm, the iron veil dispersing into the morning the way they always dispersed, without ceremony, without announcement, back to the ordinary lives that existed alongside the extraordinary ones. Grimm watched the window until the last engine faded. Then he looked at the two of them, his daughter's hand on the boy's hand, the boy's face doing something quiet and complicated and real, and he picked up his coffee. The morning came in gray and cold off the desert, and the diner held them in its warmth, and the toast cooled untouched between them, and nobody moved to leave, and the coffee kept coming without being asked. And outside, the Nevada sky went from black to gray to the specific pale color of a world that had been through something and was still here, still turning, still cold and still capable, against all reasonable expectation of morning. End of Part 5. Ava's Light. Complete. A fully fictional cinematic story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, and organizations are entirely fictional.